dispute between Georgia and some regional governments that don't want to be part of Georgia. By the way, the people of Georgia, I think they didn't have to be part of the Russian Federation. I sympathize with their demand after the end of the Cold War to be an independent country. They have a right to self-determination. But so do the people of Abkhazia and Ossetia. These two peoples had never been part of Georgia, and Joseph Stalin and his dictatorship put them as part of Georgia. Well, does it make sense for us to use our armed might in an agreement with the Georgian government to make sure to reinforce their vision of what the world should look like? And it doesn't make sense also to sour a relationship with Russia, which is a country concerned just as we would be in Mexico or Central America or in Canada. It doesn't make any sense to sour our relationship with Russia by implementing a NATO alliance with little countries all around it. In contrast, treating Russia as a friend would be enormously valuable to the security of both of our countries by expanding NATO with tiny countries. And of course, these are countries that are right around Russia. How can that not look like we have a military alliance, which is what NATO is, threatening Russia? Of course, we would think the same way. And instead of an alliance with Russia, we are seeking an alliance with weaklings and Lilliputians rather than forging a strategic relationship with a giant. So if Georgia and the other countries like Albania and Croatia, countries that I am very sympathetic with, and as I say, I am sympathetic with Georgia. I want it to be independent of Russia because that's what they want. But if they want to be in NATO, let's let them in. But if they're getting into NATO, we should be getting out, because it is not in our interest to commit our military forces to battle all over the world in disputes that have nothing to do with our security or the overall global stability of the world. I'm not suggesting, however, isolationism. That's what people always come out, oh, well, you're an isolationist. Nor am I suggesting that we should not have bilateral defense-related agreements. I certainly believe in involvement and in bilateral defense agreements as well as bilateral trade agreements. At the outset of the Cold War, we saw a clear and present threat in the Soviet Union, and we went to work strengthening our existing relationships with friendly countries and building new relationships with other countries. Well, we should do that today. We should create alliances, but we need to be realistic and honest in our assessment of the challenges we face and the factors that are in play. There are serious challenges to be overcome in the world today, and even more serious threats in the future. Radical Islam today, China soon. What we built to deter a Soviet invasion of Western Europe will not meet our needs of today, and I suggest that structure is in many ways counterproductive in dealing with today's threats. In short, an alliance with Russia and a few other powerful nations is in our interest more than a continuance of an obsolete coalition or expanding that coalition to a large number of small countries. 20 years ago, I journeyed to Afghanistan. I stood alongside Afghan warriors, the Mujahideen, who were engaged in battle against the Soviet army, which was then occupying their country. I was personally engaged in combat operations against Soviet troops during the Cold War. Very few people can say that. And my chest swelled with pride every time Ronald Reagan proclaimed our goal to be freedom for all subjugated peoples, including the Russian people. I was Ronald Reagan's speechwriter. I was one of them for 7 years. And when the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, pleaded with Gorbachev to tear down the wall, I was part of the team that broke through the foreign policy establishment's blockade that would have neutered that great historic statement even before Ronald Reagan gave it. And I cried with joy and retrospect when that wall finally came crashing down, hammered and chiseled down by freedom-loving people on both sides of that grotesquely evil barrier. I despise the Soviet Union because I loved freedom. Freedom for all people, including the Russian people. The communist government in Russia was our worst enemy. Times have changed. We need the Russians as trusted allies, if not our best friends. I recently visited Russia, and over dinner with a counterpart, I explained, as I just did, that I had been his worst enemy during the Cold War, and he stopped me right in the middle of the sentence. No, you weren't the Russian people's worst enemy. You were the enemy of communist tyranny, and thank God for that. That's what he said. There are many Russians today that fully understand that they have left communist tyranny behind, but when they look around them and look forward, they see hostility and they hear Russia vilified for acts of natural self-interest. How many times have we heard Russia vilified for charging the market price for its resources, namely natural gas, over and over again, as if charging the world price instead of subsidizing the price for the countries around it was a hostile act. Would our companies be expected to charge well below the market price to other countries for our natural resources? Over and over again, Russia was described as committing a hostile act when it did that. And after all the reform, all the military and strategic withdrawals, that hasn't made any difference to us that Russia's done this. We have kept them isolated, and we have magnified every shortcoming that we could find in the new Russian government. And all governments have shortcomings. Look, Turkey has human rights and democracy problems on par with Russia. In terms of the actual level of human rights problems, Turkey and Russia are probably on about the same level. And yes, we should stay vigilant in our insistence on an accounting and a correction of violation of human rights, and that's whether it's Russia or Turkey or any other country. But does anyone really want us to treat Turkey as a hostile power? Try to make them into an enemy? Just because they do have imperfections, and there are some examples of heavy-handed use of power and some really questionable incidents there in Turkey? Well, yes, there is. That doesn't mean we're going to turn them into our enemy and vilify everything they do. The Russians are Turkish people are wonderful people too. They've been our friends for so long. But so are the Russians. The Russians are wonderful and creative people. They share many personal values with us. Their sense of humor, their love of children, of fun, of drink, of dance, and yes, their reverence for God and faith that was never beaten out of them by the decades that they suffered under atheistic communism. There was openness and vulnerability of these people as the Soviet communist system collapsed. They made mistakes and had societal and governmental problems, no doubt about it. And all of those mistakes and all of those problems weren't all corrected. They needed support. They were vulnerable, and even as we applauded the implosion of the communist government, we did not do what was right by the Russian people. Even as they chaotically implemented massive changes and reforms, they were forced to, for example, pay off the debt that was built up during the communist dictatorship. The debt. What country could develop with that huge millstone around their neck? In fact, how ironic it was, we went to the Russians and asked them to forgive the debt of Iraq that the Saddam Hussein had run up when that dictatorship controlled Iraq. How ironic. We went to the Russians to ask them to do what we had pressured policy not to permit them to do. With that millstone around their neck of that debt, no wonder there was chaos, economic chaos. How could they have pulled together and averted such mass suffering with having to pay the entire debt of a communist dictatorship that they did not vote for? In the years since, we have been growing apart from Russia into hostile camps, even though our cooperation is paramount to the future of both of our countries. As I say, the Russians and the Americans share more than cultural traits. We now share some very real common threats. And those are radical Islam, which is upon us, and a totalitarian China, which is rapidly becoming a negative and tremendously powerful force in the world. As we have continued to treat Russia as unworthy and with suspicion, even